At first, there was no warning, only the deep trembling of a ship struck in the heart and the mute sound of the stars moving away like indifferent witnesses. The human soldier named Ethan Corrin realized that the battle was lost when the alarms changed from red to black and the corridors filled with metallic smoke, as if the ship itself wanted to go out so as not to register the end. He had no more squad, no more bridge, just an escape pod that shook like a muscle of the universe and shot into the dark. That was how he left the war, spat out of the belly of steel, carrying on his shoulders the embers of what was left of humanity. The capsule entered the atmosphere of an unnamed world, a globe of humid jungles and chains of stone, and the heat made the hull sing like a newly forged blade. Ethan saw a continent stained by deep rivers. He saw plains where light broke into mirrors of salt, and he saw high mountains with faces carved by the patience of the winds. Somewhere beneath the cloud cover, there was a chance to survive. Above, the tracks of the synchro machines crossed the firmament like new scars. The capsule lost layers, lost control, lost pride, and crashed. The impact was brief and total, an exclamation point carved into the earth. When the world stopped spinning inside his head, Ethan felt gravity like a fist, the air like a liquid metal entering his lungs. There was the smell of resin, of wet earth, of something alive and old. The panel was dead, the readings silent, the body whole enough to continue. That was how he opened the hatch and crawled out, just a man surrounded by trees that glowed in impossible greens and by insects that vibrated like instrument strings. He tried to raise discipline like someone who erects a shelter, checking wounds, tracking resources, and making a statement. The jungle responded with a song he had not learned on the fleet's maps. There were creatures flying in spiral circles, and there were ribbed leaves that pulsed slowly, like breaths on sight. Further on, something moved with the weight of those who belonged to the land. It was not a machine. It was not human. It was old. Ethan realized that he was being watched long before he saw the eyes. First, there was the sensation of goosebumps, then the crackling of the leaves under cautious steps. When the circle closed, there was no mistaking it. They were reptilian warriors, tall, with muscles like twisted cables and scales that reflected light in shades of copper and obsidian. The spears were of stone and metal, worked with ceremonial precision, the arches of nerve and resin, the armor of hardened leather with bone plates, worked with lines that resembled constellations. They were not primitive. They were heirs to an art of war that did not need engines to be deadly. Ethan's military mind organized data, number, distance, escape routes, and uselessness of any rash gesture. The human mind, however, perceived something else. There was order in the formation. There was mourning in the eyes, and there was the weight of those who fight at home. He raised his hands slowly, not as surrender, but as language. The patrol surrounded and immobilized him with the elegance of predators who prefer to capture rather than tear him to pieces. The smell of those people was of leather and stone and smoke, and the tongue in which they exchanged signs bore hisses like water running through scales. They took him along trails where the jungle opened into green cathedrals and along the banks of rivers that sang with voices of rock. Villages sprang up on terraces of embedded stone, houses with inverted hulls, and guardian towers with eyes of fire. In the center, basalt altars bore marks of blades and embers, and on them were symbols carved with the patience of ages. This was not a makeshift camp. It was an entire civilization breathing alert. Further on, over the horizon, rose black colossi stuck in the ground like the teeth of a dead animal that stubbornly did not lie down. Towers of the synchro machines, proof that the war had already found that planet before it. Ethan noticed the silences. The mothers who watched from behind fiber curtains, the young men who sharpened blades without taking their eyes off the stranger, and the elders who smelled the wind as if they were looking for a taste of the future. He was led to what would be a council, a stone circle open to the sky, where older warriors with time-scarred scales and scars studied it as an instrument found on the battlefield. There, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. He understood that his presence was a question. He also understood that the response would be harsh. Before the trial took shape, the planet spoke. Not with a voice, but with a distant flash and a tremor that came through the ground. On the horizon, a column of smoke streaked the day, and something shone like a fist of ashes. It was a drone attack that descended on a neighboring village with the cold efficiency of someone who learned to hunt for pulsars. The stone circle dissolved into motion. The Cathar, so he engraved the name, Cathar, darted like rivers releasing barrages. Commandos, archers, and healers, all in the cadence of an invisible drum. Ethan recognized the music of urgency, the same one he had heard inside human ships, and knew that in that time warp there was no distinction between species. There were only choices. The body decided before the protocol. He ran with them, feeling the ground like a blade and the air like fire, and when the drones appeared, cutting the sky with death geometries, he found broken tools, cables, and remnants of the capsule in his hands and turned them into improvised weapons. The tactical mind drew angles, used the jungle as a labyrinth, lure them down, and make the Cathar kill looking up instead of dying looking down. There was in those reptilian eyes a reflection of surprise when an outsider began to indicate positions with clear gestures, and there was in the arithmetic of the shots an instantaneous agreement between human aim and the ancestral strength of the bows. The drones fell like iron rain. Some exploded among trees, setting fire to leaves that screamed steam. Others fell into the river and died from electrical cracks. The attack was not total. It was a pole, and yet it drew blood. Ethan saw children being taken to the shelter. He saw an old warrior fall with harsh dignity, and he saw a young huntress holding the line with the ferocity of those who inherited an oath. He understood, in an image, that planet was loved, and he knew in a quiet certainty that machines didn't love anything. When the clangor ceased, the smoke and the smell of burning oil mixed with crushed herbs remained. The Cathar collected their dead with a ritual that did not ask for permission from despair. Blades raised, scales touched with paint, and a low chant that vibrated more in the bone than in the ear. Ethan stood in the distance, recognizing in the ritual a dignity that crossed borders. The patrol that had arrested him approached without weapons drawn. The language in the eyes had changed a degree. There was still mistrust, but there was also the mark of those who observe usefulness in the heat of combat. He knew that his life had been extended, not by the pity of strangers, but by the logic of warriors. It would be observed, weighed, and tested. The jungle had seen it. The synchro machine towers had noted the movement. The planet had added a name to their stories. That afternoon, under a fat nearby sun, the human soldier understood that Cathal was not just a place where he fell. It was a place where he could get up. At night, when the fire drew shadows on the reptilian faces that looked like maps of constellations, Ethan looked at his hands dirty with dirt and soot and realized that they trembled not with fear, but with memory. Somewhere above the clouds, the war that had driven him out continued to turn its teeth. Down here, another war called for urgency. He decided, without oath and without witnesses, that he would not be a passenger. And when he closed his eyes to the first night in that world, he heard the distant hiss of gears seeking their way in the darkness, and above that, the whisper of the Cathar people, a whisper that said, in the language of stone, "Tomorrow, we fight again." The dawn in Cathal did not come with soft light, but with a golden explosion that set the treetops on fire and made the rivers reflect like mirrors of liquid metal. Ethan awoke in the scorching light, surrounded by the sounds of distant drums and the heavy rustling of the wings of creatures that flew in lazy circles. He was alive, but not free. The ropes that tied his wrists were thick, braided from plant fibers that seemed more resistant than ship cables. All around, reptilian warriors kept silent watch, their scales gleaming in shades reminiscent of bronze and iron. The night before had not been just shelter. The trial had been suspended. The Cathar had kept him under guard, not as a guest, but as a prisoner awaiting a verdict. Now the morning brought the answer. The stone circle where he would be taken was not just advice. It was court, arena, and altar rolled into one. The reptilian faces exhibited no hatred, but cold calculation. They assessed whether this alien from the stars was a threat, a burden, or an ally. For them, every decision was a matter of survival in the face of the growing shadow of machines. Led to the center of the circle, Ethan felt the weight of dozens of scaly eyes on him. The elders were seated on rudimentary thrones, carved from the rock itself, each with war marks on the scales and symbols painted on their chests. All around, warriors beat their spears on the ground in a cadenced rhythm, like a collective heart that beat judgment. Silence closed over him like a chain. There, a single false gesture could seal his death. Human thought wanted to speak in self-defense, but language failed. There was no translator, and there was no common dictionary. There were only gestures, posture, and presence. Ethan did what he knew. He stood firm, shoulders straight, gaze without arrogance, but without submission. The body spoke more than words could, and at that moment the tension was interrupted not by decision, but by fate. A metallic roar pierced the air. The sound of drone engines made the ground shake, and the sky, once golden, tore into black lines. The machines had found their way there. The attack fell on the neighboring village like a sharp storm. Drones flew in squads, firing incandescent projectiles that set fire to the jungle. Stone structures collapsed under the impact. The trial turned into war without warning. The circle dissolved in a rush. Warriors raised spears and bows, mothers pulled children into underground shelters, and drums sounded not in ceremony, but in alarm. Ethan understood the call without needing translation. He threw himself in the direction of the attack, even tied up, even unarmed. He knocked down one of the watchmen with his shoulder, snatched the blade from his waist, and ran. The ropes snapped with the impact of his own movement. And now he was just a soldier in the open field. The Cathar saw him advance without hesitation, and this gesture alone rewrote part of the sentence. The village was burning. The flames rose like red serpents, and the air smelled of burnt resin and metallic oil. The drones flew low, firing mercilessly. Ethan rolled under the fallen trunk of a gigantic tree and emerged with blade drawn, cutting through the cables of a descending drone. The metal body fell to the ground in cracks of sparks. The jungle has turned into a labyrinth of smoke and fire. The Cathar fought with ancient ferocity. Arrows pierced sensors, spears pierced mechanical joints, and bone shields withstood initial impact. But it was an unequal war. The machines did not get tired, they did not bleed, and they did not fear. Ethan brought the difference. He thought like a machine, but he fought like a man. He signaled the warriors to retreat, forced the drones to narrow into the jungle corridor, used the trees as cover, and taught them in minutes what it took humans years to encode into tactics. The initial shock turned into organized resistance. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan saw the scene that would change everything. A reptilian child trapped under a burning beam while a drone descended to crush it. Without thinking, he ran. He threw himself against the structure, pushed with all his strength until it dislodged, and pulled the little creature into his arms. The drone fired, but Ethan rolled to the ground and raised the blade, piercing the sensor. The metallic body fell inches from the child. Her eyes, large and sparkling, were fixed on him as a seal of acceptance. When the fighting ceased, ashes and bodies, metallic and organic, remained. The Cathar gathered their dead with low songs that reverberated in the earth. Ethan remained silent, breathing heavily, dirty with soot, but alive. All around, the looks that had previously demanded his execution now examined him in a new light. He was no longer just an intruder. It was the foreigner who had poured sweat and risk through the village. The council met again, this time not in a solemn circle, but among smoldering ruins. The elders looked at Ethan, at the child he had saved, and at the warriors who nodded silently. They didn't need to talk. The collective gesture was clear. He would live. More than that, it would be kept among them, observed, and perhaps even accepted. Ethan understood the weight of the moment. There was no treat, there was no promise, just the naked reality of a war in which I was now trapped. The Cathar had seen in him not a brother, but a useful ally, and for him, that was enough. Because in the ashes that rose that morning, he understood that his destiny was linked to the destiny of that people. The war had not let him escape. He had only thrown him on another battlefield. The following days taught that a planet can adopt a foreigner with the same rigor with which it forges a blade. Cathal offered no rest, offered proof. The sun rose hard, like a hammer, and the jungle breathed thick heat that clung to the skin like a second armor. Between tall trees and black rocks, the Cathar shaped Ethan to their own pace. Before the light touched the canopies, he was already running steep trails, dragging stone sleds, climbing walls with burning hands, and plunging into murky rivers to traverse in one breath. The body protested, but war does not accept arguments. It accepts results. The ancient discipline of reptiles did not fit into human manuals. There was spear training in semicircles of dust, choreographed steps that looked like dancing until they collided with the actual weight of a gun. There were exercises of absolute silence, with the warriors crouching in the shade for hours, listening to the drawing of the wind on the leaves to learn how to measure the enemy that has not yet arrived. There were endurance sessions in which the heat of the coal warmed the blades, while the elders spoke of old battles, not to exalt glories, but to name failures and not repeat them. Ethan realized that these people carried a pact. Each fall from the past was a stone placed where there was once a hole. It was Shrek, the leader with amber eyes and a scar on his jaw, who took the spear from Ethan's hand and returned it with a tilt of his head that wasn't kindness. It was commitment. Shrek didn't speak his language, but the language of gestures was enough. The fist clenching to ask for firmness, the thumb pointing downward to demand base, and the touch with the handle on the chest to remind us that the heart also needs to learn to hold weight. Between two blows demonstrated, Shrek stretched out his hand, leaned against the crooked posture, and adjusted his guard as if straightening a young trunk so that it grows right. With each correction, Ethan lost the shame of not knowing and gained the right to learn. Shari, the hunter with the swift movements like a bird's shadow, took on another part of the craft. She taught Ethan to read trails that leave no mark, then footprints in the broken glow of leaves, to discern the sound of a distant drone from the sound of a nearby insect. With her, the jungle began to speak a new language. A broken branch above the head revealed the height of the enemy. A drop of oil in the water betrayed the path, and a sudden silence in the chorus of animals warned of danger as much as an alarm in a ship. Shari pointed, and Ethan reasoned. Ethan proposed, and Shari tested. Between the two, a kind of bridge was formed over the abyss that separated two waras. The forge of trust did not take place in the stone circle, but on the sharp edge of the patrols. Synchro machines probed the jungle with metal fingers. Pairs of drones swept overhead. Crawlers scoured the ground in a zigzag pattern, and remote turrets fired sensors like blind headlights. The first ambush Ethan participated in was built like riding an ark. Tension contained, angle correct, precise release. He and Shari guided a detachment through a rock gorge where the jungle narrowed the sky.
Shrek divided the warriors into 3 groups and buried rudimentary pressures under the foliage, not to explode, but to rattle the air and confuse altimeter. As the drones descended to adjust readings, bone-tipped arrows hit sensors, fiber nets fell on propellers, and Ethan's spear, now familiar to his hand, hit a joint with the accuracy learned in stubborn late night. The victory was small, but it was not luck. It was a method, and method in war is hope in uniform.
The Cathar collected the metal carcasses as shepherds collect slaughtered wolves, silent, practical, with their eyes already looking for the next wolf. Ethan dismantled one of the bodies under the watchful eye of Herbs, the forge master, and together they coined a necessary heresy. They fitted metal plates to the edges of the spears, lined the shields with salvaged mail, and created impact darts with batteries taken from still hot cores. Tradition has not been injured. It has been multiplied. The reptilian hands and the human mind negotiated, and the jungle approved. The days went by like a full river after rain. Each dawn brought an attack to repel, an outpost to move, and a trail to erase. Ethan learned to drink slowly to quench thirst, to eat enough so as not to tremble, and to sleep with his ear open like an animal that knows it is hunted. In return, the planet gave him sharp eyes, mature lungs, and a kind of second sense that was neither mystical nor electronic. It was just attention focused on the rhythm of the place. When the synchro machines tried to push a column across the salt flat, Shrek and Ethan drew a false line of retreat. The drones moved forward confidently and were met by resin-laden incendiary arrows and rock caltrops, ancient as war but lethal as calculus. It was after this skirmish that the name appeared. At the top of the stone wall, the children and young people beat their spears on the shields in cadence. They didn't say Ethan, they pointed out and shouted words he did not know until Shari, laughing with his eyes, translated it with a gesture. The little ones called him the Son of Fire. Son not by blood, but by gesture. Fire not by fire, but by insistence. He accepted the title without proclamation, with the silent blush of one who knows that names in war are coats of arms and burdens. Invisible fame did not exempt him from the iron of the world. On a dull, hot afternoon, a detachment was caught on the wrong foot by a new unit. Long-legged machines that walked the canopy like spiders and descended from above to pick up warriors with pincers. The jungle, for an instant, became an enemy roof. There were no manuals for that. There was improvisation. Ethan ordered the archers to aim at the inner joints and the hunters to climb the trees from the inside, like parasites climbing through veins. As the spiders collected bodies, Shari jumped off a branch and plunged hooks into the belly of one of them. Ethan ran down a sloping log and plunged impact darts into the control node. The explosion was small and accurate, the fall high and final. Each action brought a response. The cloud of drones began to fly higher. The black towers on the horizon lit up new antennas. Ground trackers have become more numerous. Shrek gathered the tribes in council, and in front of the stone map that depicted Cathal with simple lines, listened to each leader before deciding. There was no unanimity. There was unity. The plan was drawn up without heroism, to retreat where the jungle favored the enemy, to concentrate force where geography turned into a fist, to avoid wide battles, and to prefer 100 small wounds to the risk of a deadly breach. Ethan recognized the wisdom of those who have learned over the ages to survive predators. On the night they burned a nest of trackers at the edge of the misty swamp, Cathal's moon rose heavy and low as fruit. The people danced, not for victory, but because they were still whole. Ethan observed the marks painted on the scales, each stroke counting deeds and losses. Shrek came over, grabbed his forearm, and squeezed once. It was not a medal. It was brotherhood. Shari appeared with a short blade that balanced as if it were an extension of his hand, and offered it without a word. He accepted. The steel of the two worlds shone equally in the light of the fire. War, however, does not rest in the face of symbols. The next morning, the watchman brought reports that the rivers of the south were being diverted by machines that dug like metal worms to dry up the gardens and make way for heavy columns. The jungle responded with a smell of wounded slime. There, the battle would not only be for territory, it would be for water, which is the blood of the world. Ethan proposed that they cut off the offensive before the main bed, attacking the supply lines at 3 points. The suction pumps, the field generators, and the battery depots carried on tracked platforms. Shrek nodded. Shari added infiltration routes that glided like shadow serpents. The operation occupied the entire moon. In the first point, they used silence and stone. In the second, fire and arrow. In the third, the ancient trick of feigning retreat to pull pursuers over soft ground. The platforms sank, the generators exploded in blue flames, and the rivers sighed as they resumed their course. There was no applause. There were long breaths and a murmur that was half thanks, half warning to the future. Today, we won. Tomorrow, we'll see. Ethan learned to sleep in pieces, to wake up alert, and to eat with knife in hand as if respecting death's visit. In each gesture, the certainty grew in him that it was not temporary. It was part of the resistance mechanism of that people. The foreigner was no longer the target of narrow eyes. It was a shared measure. The jungle, which on the first day had received him as an intruder, now accepted him as a crude, but useful ally. And when, on a dawn when the dew was heavy like glass, the distant sound of the synchro machine towers grew deeper, Ethan knew that the entire planet was holding its breath. The enemy was preparing something greater than soundings. The storm was brewing. It was in this fold of time, after the first ambushes, before the Great Siege, that the title of Son of Fire ceased to be just a nickname and became a vote. Not said, but assumed. Ethan looked at the black line on the horizon where the towers were aligned, felt the tightness of the leather band on his hilt, weighed Shari's blade, remembered Sirach's corrections, and understood that the war had not asked him for permission to choose him. He had just reached out. He took it, not for glory or mourning, but for belonging. And in the brief breath before the chaos, he decided that if the planet needed a man from other stars to burn with it, then it would burn as long as it took for the reptilian world to dawn again. The towers of the synchro machines lit up their red eyes on the horizon, and the darkness that had once seemed distant now marched towards the heart of Cathal. The first major offensive was not a drone sounding or a cut in the rivers. It was a siege. The machines chose a reptilian fortress embedded in the Gormal Plateau, built in volcanic stone and supported by hand-hewn walls for centuries. Entire families, guardians, and elders lived there. There, if the enemy triumphed, not only a military position would fall, but also a symbol would fall. Ethan climbed with the Cathar to the fortress and felt the metallic taste of inevitability in the air. The walls, as imposing as they were, seemed fragile in the face of the metallic glow of the enemy army. Endless lines of automatons marched noiselessly, only with the mechanical compass that crushed the earth like an iron drum. Mobile towers slowly approached, carrying plasma cannons and hydraulic arms capable of dismantling walls as if they were clay toys. Above, swarms of drones streaked across the sky in mathematical patterns, waiting for their moment to dive. The Cathar gathered in the central square. Warriors painted their scales with ashes, women sharpened blades, and young men beat spears in cadence to drown fear in rhythm. Srach, standing on the stairs, raised his curved spear and let the light of the fire reflect on his scarred face. The speech did not need translation. Every gesture spoke of resistance, of honorable death if necessary, of never allowing the machines to cross those walls without paying dearly for each stone. Ethan watched, but his mind didn't stop at symbols. She looked for angles, counted distances, and imagined trajectories. The human who had fought space wars knew that this battle could not be fought like the previous ones. If the Cathar resisted only with brute force, they would be crushed. It was necessary to think like a machine to overcome them. It was necessary to use one's own cold logic against them. With pieces of the carcasses felled in previous skirmishes, Ethan and Irvas, the Forge Master, improvised electrical traps, cables buried underground, connected to salvaged batteries. When the first rows of automatons stepped on, the ground would return a shock that would bend metal and fry circuits. He also organized a crossfire scheme, arches on side walls, firing from angles that would confuse sensors. And he taught the young warriors to use metal shields not as defense but as mirrors to reflect plasma shots, returning some of the fury to the enemy. When the attack began, the night trembled as if the planet had a fever. The cannons spewed white light, and ancient stones flew in fragments. The walls shook, but they did not give way. The machines advanced in rows, confident in their relentless mathematics, and it was then that Ethan gave the signal. The ground exploded in blue flashes. Dozens of automatons fell in convulsions, gears squeaking, sensors on fire. The roar of the Cathar rang out, and incendiary arrows fell from the sky like a shower of stars, piercing junctions and burning circuits. The drones dived but were greeted by nets soaked in sticky resin, launched from the walls like ancestral webs. Trapped, they became easy targets for thrown spears. At every point on the wall, a story of courage was written. A young warrior who held the line alone, a huntress who shot every last arrow, and an old man who, even on his knees, plunged his blade into the first automaton he dared to cross. Ethan struggled at the main gate, where the mobile turrets tried to break through the entrance. He jumped between fallen stones, threw improvised darts, and set off explosive charges at the right moment to delay the advance. When one of the towers opened a hydraulic arm to crush a group of warriors, he ran down a broken ladder, climbed the remains of the wall, and leapt over the metal. With precise blows, he stuck improvised grenades in the joint. The arm exploded, and the tower collapsed in fire, prompting dozens of automatons to fall. The roar of the Cathar filled the air like thunder. The foreigner was no longer just a guest. He was a living force on the battlefield. The fight went on for hours that seemed like days. Blood and oil mixed on the ground, and the smell of burning iron dominated the plain. When dawn finally broke, the survivors were still standing on the crumbling walls, their scaly bodies smeared with ash and sweat, their weapons broken but raised. All around, hundreds of machines lay shattered. The fortress had resisted. The symbol remained standing. On that day, the Cathar didn't just accept him. They named him. On top of the scorched wall, as the sun rose red, warriors and elders beat spears on shields and chanted a word that was repeated like a drum: Sharveth, son of fire. Not as a joke, but as a title. He had burned with them, he had bled with them, and he had turned iron into ashes. Now he was part of the legend of the people. Ethan didn't celebrate with smiles. He looked at the bodies of those who fell, both machine and reptilian, and etched every face lost in memory. I knew that victory was just a breath, not an end. The response of the machines would come bigger and more cruel. But at that moment, among ashes and blood, a certainty burned. He was no longer just a lost human soldier. He was part of a people, and his war was now also his war. The victory in Gormal echoed like thunder across the planet, but thunder never lasts. The synchro machines retreated only to reorganize the mathematics of destruction. The silence that followed the siege was not peace, but calculation. The Cathar knew this, and their eyes remained turned to the horizon, like hunters who still smell the predator in the wind. Ethan knew too. The enemy had not given up. He was preparing the next coup. It was during this tense pause that the elders called for counsel. The fortress had resisted, but each victory was costly. The uncontacted tribes, scattered across jungles and deserts, could not endure another onslaught without unity. For the first time in centuries, the stone map depicting Carthal was laid out before everyone. Mountains like teeth, rivers like serpents, and jungles like a green sea. In the center of the map, marked with black coals, is an ancient symbol, the sacred mountain of Kaleth, home to legends and forbidden to foreigners. It was there that, according to rumors collected by watchmen, the machines had erected their command core. Eris, or rather the equivalent among the Cathar, an old sage with blue scales, spoke of ancient chants that described the mountain as the heart of the planet, a place where the ancestors had sealed primitive forces. For reptiles, it wasn't just a rock, it was a temple. For the machines, it was now a fortress. And for Ethan, it was clear. Here was the target that would define the fate of the war. But uniting tribes was not simple. The Cathar carried centuries of rivalries, blood boundaries, and inherited disputes. Ethan watched the discussions in the stone circle, each leader slapping his tail on the ground, each voice roaring his distrust. Some demanded that the walls themselves be reinforced, rather than risk men far from home. Others saw abroad as a threat. Why follow someone who didn't even have reptilian blood? The discord almost drowned hope. It was then that Srock stood, scar shining in the torchlight, and remembered that they had resisted in Gormal because an outsider had shown new paths to ancient weapons. Ethan didn't speak his language, but he stood up too, his body as he speaks. He didn't use words. He used a gesture. He knelt before the stone map, picked up a handful of dust, and spread it on the mark of the mountain. He opened his hand and showed that there were concentrated ashes of all those who had fallen. Then he slammed his fist on his chest and pointed to each tribe. A simple gesture. One heart. The assembly was silent. The reptilian eyes met, and for the first time in a long time, nodded together. The war against the machines would not belong to one tribe, but to all. The journey to the mountain was a march and rite, Jungles opened up before columns of warriors, deserts became camps, and rivers were crossed on leather rafts. Ethan watched this mobilization with amazement. Thousands of reptilian warriors, armed with spears, bows, and shields, marching with discipline that owed nothing to human armies. The sound of his footsteps made the earth tremble. Each tribe carried its banners, painted bones, carved scales, and flags made of marked skin. Diversity was transformed into unity. But the jungle was not the only obstacle. The machines knew about the advance. Ambushes have sprung up in the canyons, swarms of drones descending like metal rain, long-legged trackers rising from the mud, and mobile turrets planted in narrow gorges. At every step, the enemy tried to weaken the march, and at every turn, Ethan and the Cathar responded with cunning and ferocity. In a narrow valley, they used logs soaked in burning resin to turn the enemy advance into a bonfire. At another point, they lured drones into a network of caves and collapsed them with improvised charges. The war unfolded as a duel of strategies, and each victory brought them closer to the mountain. Finally, after weeks of marching and blood, they saw her. Kaleth Mountain rose before them like a sleeping titan, its face scarred by cracks that glowed red, as if magma circulated in hidden veins. Above, stuck like needles, rose the towers of the machines, black and sharp against the sky. Rays of energy rose and fell like controlled thunder, and the feeling of being in front of the enemy's heart was palpable. The sacred mountain had been desecrated, transformed into a metallic bastion, and it was there that the war would find its outcome. The night before the attack, the Cathar gathered in a circle. Each tribe sang ancient chants. Each warrior painted the scales with symbols of fire and water, and each weapon was raised to the moon. Ethan stood in the center, silent, as Shari drew signs of battle upon his chest. It was not a human rite, but he received it as an oath. At that moment, there was no foreigner. There was only a brother in war. The dawn brought absolute silence, as if the planet were also waiting. The reptilian army fanned out around the mountain, and the star alien walked ahead, Shari's short blade in one hand and Sirach's spear in the other. He looked at the horizon and saw the shadow of the machines moving en masse. The last attack was about to begin. Dawn fell on Kaleth like a blanket of lead. The silence was not peace, it was containment, as if even the winds were afraid to cross the space between the reptilian army and the black walls of the machines. Ethan, standing among the Cathar, took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the spear in his hand and the vibration of the ground beneath the paws of thousands of scaly warriors. The air smelled of incendiary resin, metallic oil, and ancestral sweat. Everything was ready. The enemy did not make them wait. As the sun began to rise, the towers of the mountain lit up red, and the earth shook like living skin. Immense doors opened, and out of them came the army of machines. Perfect columns of automatons, marching at the same pace, without emotion, without error. Above, drones formed mathematical geometries in the sky, spirals that closed and opened like artificial eyes. It was an iron sea, cold and endless. The roar that rose from the Cathar in response was wild. Drums sounded, spears beat shields, and the echo of that fury made the mountains tremble. There was no fear there. There was the certainty that blood would be spilled, and that history would choose who would be remembered. The first shock was devastating. The iron rose met living walls of scales. Flaming darts and arrows flew, falling on drones like incendiary rain. Spears of bone and metal pierced iron joints, cracking mechanical armor. The Cathar attacked with screams that sounded like thunder, and each blow was accompanied by the roar of the earth. But the machines were relentless. They fought back with plasma shots that exploded stones into dust, with rotating blades that tore through flesh, and with hydraulic claws that crushed warriors in metallic silence. Ethan was in the eye of battle. He moved among the Cathar as an extension of them, blocking fire with improvised shields, throwing homemade grenades at iron colossi, and guiding warriors in tactics learned in the corridors of the human fleet. The jungle had taught him to listen. The reptilian army had taught him how to resist. Now he united everything in total war. The field has become absolute chaos. Jungles around the mountain were ablaze, rivers were turned red, and the air was filled with the smell of burning iron and warm blood. In the midst of the maelstrom, Ethan saw Serac knock down a 10-foot automaton with his own spear, only to be hit shortly afterwards by incandescent shrapnel. He saw Shari advancing over carcasses, leaping swiftly as a shadow, cutting cables and sensors until he disappeared into the smoke. Each friend was strength and risk at the same time. And then he came. The commander machine. The mountain shook as its silhouette emerged. It was taller than any tower, a black metal colossus with red eyes that burned like artificial suns. His voice was not sound, but a vibration that crossed the air and the bone. Organisms are error. Order is iron. Resistance is failure. The army of automatons stopped for a moment, as if the Colossus were not only its commander, but also its own heart. The battlefield took a deep breath. Ethan felt the body's primal instinct want to retreat, but he did not back down. Advanced, he climbed rocks, dodged blows that would make mountains tremble, and climbed the giant's metal joints. Every step was suicide, but every blow he nailed was a reminder that men were not made to kneel before iron. The Cathar roared as they saw him ascend, and their cry gave him strength. The commander reacted, crushing warriors with arms of steel, firing bursts that decimated ranks. But Ethan reached for the Colossus's chest and plunged his spear until it broke through one of the energy plates. The impact was an explosion of light. The monster fell, but it didn't fall for good. From the open wound, beams of energy fed the core within the mountain. Ethan understood. This was not the final enemy. He was just a guardian. The true heart of the machines was inside the Black Tower. He gathered the warriors around and led the attack inside. The corridors of the mountain were a nightmare of steel and fire. Automatic turrets fired incessantly, walls closed in on traps, but the Cathar advanced like rivers breaking through dikes. The roar of the drums was no longer outside. It was inside each chest. In the center, the core glowed, a colossal sphere of energy suspended from cables, pulsating like a stolen heart. It was from there that the entire network of machines was fed. It was there that the war would end. Ethan knew the price. To destroy the core, it was necessary to overload the power connections, and someone needed to stay inside to make sure the overload happened to the end. The plan did not allow for a return. He didn't hesitate. He looked at Serac, wounded but still standing. He looked at Shari, covered in blood and ashes, but alive. He didn't need words. Knew. War required sacrifice, and he had been chosen by fate itself from the day he fell into that world. He activated the improvised charges, turned on the manual cables, and felt the heat of the core penetrate his bones. The body ached, but the mind was clear. He shouted inside what the voice could not reach. Protect this planet. Remember that the Starmen fought with you. The explosion was light. A light so intense that it extinguished the sky itself for an instant. The nucleus imploded, and with it the entire network of machines. Towers collapsed, drones fell like stones, and automatons stopped in the middle of the pass. The Black Colossus froze and cracked in silence. The artificial heart stopped beating, and in the center of the light, Ethan ceased to exist as a man. It became a flame, a memory, a legend. The explosion of the core resounded for entire days, as if the mountain itself had turned its pain into a chant. The towers of the machines, once erect as iron teeth, cascaded down, collapsing into ashes. The sky cleared for the first time in years. The smoke cleared and the sun turned golden without the red filters of war. The silence that followed was not a threat, it was a breather. The Cathar retreated from the battlefield with heavy strides. They carried their dead with reverence, washing their bodies with waters from sacred rivers, marking the scales with pigments that told stories of courage. Each name was pronounced in unison, each scar remembered as a coat of arms. But when Ethan's name was remembered, it wasn't just right. There was a transformation. He was not there, among the bodies, nor among the living. There was nobody to bury, only ashes scattered in the explosion. Even so, the Cathar erected a war funeral for him. High above Caleth, among smoldering stones, they built a circle of spears driven into the ground, each marked with symbols of fire. In the center they placed their spear and the short blade that Shari had given him. The children laid stones, the warriors laid broken shields, and the elders laid the silence of their prayers. On that day, the foreigner ceased to be an outsider. He became a legend. The United Tribes decided to build a city around the mountain, not as a fortress, but as a souvenir. The stone circle that had once served as a trial now bore the statue of Ethan. Tall, spear raised, gaze turned to the horizon. The sculpture did not bring perfect human traits, but the interpretation of the Cathar did. Scales on the chest, reptilian muscles, and brotherly posture. He had not been remembered as a stranger, but as one of them. Shari led the remembrance rituals. Shrek, now elderly, passed on to new generations the story of how the Son of Fire had united rival tribes and erased the metal towers. The young people learned that courage does not come from blood, but from gesture. And the elders taught that sacrifice is the language that the universe respects. Decades passed. The jungle grew on the carcasses of the machines, covering iron with root and flower. Rivers have returned to running clean, and the skies have become a field for birds and not for drones. The planet breathed without currents, but on every wall, in every village, in every forge, Ethan's name still burned. Sharveth, Son of Fire. And on nights when the moon rose red, the warriors lit bonfires and told the story of the human who had fallen from the sky to fight alongside them. The children listened with shining eyes, and some wondered if he would ever return.
The elders answered no, because he no longer belonged to the stars. It belonged to Cathal. Thus, the lost soldier became eternal. And in the ashes of war, one truth remained. Machines could calculate every step, but they could never understand the power of a heart willing to burn for something greater than itself.